I'm a local truck driver for a well-known grocery store in our city. This means I stay within a 50-mile radius, driving between the warehouse and several stores each day to deliver pallets of groceries. I never have to drive more than 2 hours at a time, so I get to sleep in my own bed every night, unlike most cross-country or regional truckers who often end up at truck stops. One day was pretty typical as I made deliveries to a few stores. I reached my last delivery location around 9 p.m., and it took about half an hour for them to unload the trailer. Then, I was free to head back to the warehouse and finish for the night. This last drive was always the longest since the warehouse was located on the edge of the city, far from everything else. An hour into the drive, and about 15 minutes away from the warehouse, I pulled into a gas station to refuel because my tank was running on empty. I went to the diesel section, started the gas pump, and leaned against the truck to wait. On the other side of the gas station, a group was standing outside a parked pickup truck, the only other people there. They kept glancing over at me and my truck, which was strange. I figured they were just waiting for me to leave so they could do something foolish without any witnesses. Once my truck was full, I put the pump back and got in, driving out of the gas station. As I left, the group got into their pickup and pulled out right behind me. This was definitely more than odd now. They weren't even trying to hide their intentions as they swerved behind me, unable to keep a consistent speed. I grabbed my phone from its mount and called the police to report the group for reckless and possibly drunk driving. Being in a large semi, I didn't feel unsafe for myself, but I was worried about anyone else on the road. After a few more minutes, the pickup swerved into the lane next to me, sped up until they were right across from my window, and then sped up again to cut in front of me, slamming on the brakes. I had no choice but to brake as well, stopping just before hitting them. Immediately, all their doors swung open, and 4 of them came running to either side of my truck, trying to open the doors and get in. I quickly put the truck in reverse to create some distance before shifting back into drive. My only options were to risk driving off the road, which could topple my trailer, or ram through their pickup. I chose the latter, and all 4 of them ran off the road just before I hit their truck. Within 30 seconds, I was long gone. When I arrived at the warehouse, the police had already shown up at the scene, finding their pickup on the side of the road and all 4 of them standing by it. The officer mentioned they were all intoxicated and uncooperative in explaining their actions. Whatever their intentions were, it was pretty frightening to have 4 drunk and aggressive guys trying to break into my truck. Although it all happened so quickly and might not seem too bad, I think if I hadn't acted so fast, it could have escalated into something truly awful. But there's really no way to know what could have happened. I was driving back from a friend's house about an hour away and lost track of time, so I didn't leave until around 2 a.m. I was really tired, and the drive was pretty boring as most of the way home was a long, straight road with no other cars in sight for the first 20 minutes. It was just me staring at the endless pavement ahead, trying not to let my eyes shut. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated something on the roadway ahead of me. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I got closer, I had to slow down and eventually stop. There was a semi-truck parked in the middle of the road, blocking both lanes. I sat there for a few seconds, completely puzzled by what I was seeing. We were at least 30 minutes from the nearest town, and there was nothing out here. The only reason anyone would stop out here is if there was an emergency. I looked to the right of the truck and saw that there might be enough room for me to get around the trailer, but there was a steep hill on the shoulder that would have been really risky to drive on. The other side of the truck had trees too close together for me to drive between. After being there for a whole minute, I figured this had to be an emergency, and my best, maybe only option was to check on them. I got out of my car and walked up to the front of the trailer. I remember how quiet it was outside, like the night was completely still and empty. As I got up to the front, I realized the light was on in the driver's cabin. I went up to the door, lightly knocked on it and called out, asking if they were okay. The window was too high to see through from the ground, and there was no response after a few seconds. I called out again, but there wasn't even the sound of any movement inside. My gut was telling me something was seriously off. I looked down the road ahead and then back at the road I came from, seeing nothing but fog in the distance, which only reminded me how far away I was from anyone else. I grabbed the side of the door, lifted myself up onto the steps, and looked inside the window. The cabin was a total mess, with stuff scattered everywhere, almost as if they'd crashed. But nobody was inside. Then I noticed the door on the other side was wide open. I stepped back onto the road and began walking around the truck to investigate the open door, but was stopped in my tracks when I saw a man in the forest, walking up the side of the hill. He was tall, with shoulder-length hair and a very disheveled appearance. "Hey man, are you okay?" I called out. The man didn't look at me but continued coming up from the forest and onto the road. In the faint light from my headlights, I saw dark red stains all around his clothes, and his face was covered in dirt and grime. Thinking he was clearly not okay, I offered to help, but he continued to ignore me. That was until I said I could call 911 for him. He immediately stopped walking and shot a look at me, holding eye contact for a few long seconds. "I'm fine," he said in a deep, threatening tone. I stopped talking and watched him get into the truck, then rushed back to my car as the truck started driving away. I turned around and drove right back to my friend's house, where I called 911 and gave every detail I could remember. Unsurprisingly, the case never went further than that. What happened on that road is still a mystery, one that terrifies me. The way the truck was stopped, sideways with the cabin looking as chaotic as it did, makes me think something or someone forced them to stop. What happened afterward is debatable, but the man I saw probably wasn't the original truck driver, and I think we can all assume what likely happened in the forest below the road. I worked at Papa John's for a couple of years at the end of high school and the beginning of college, delivering pizzas and sometimes helping with cleaning and other tasks because I worked nights. This was my usual 4 to 1 shift on a slow weekday. By 10 p.m., we weren't getting any orders, so we started cleaning and preparing for closing so we could leave right at 11. But at 10:45, the store phone rang. My manager picked it up, and from what he was saying, I knew someone was placing an order. Despite my shift ending in 15 minutes, I still had to deliver the order, so I was visibly annoyed. I waited for the pizza to be ready, then left just before 11. The address wasn't too far, just under 10 minutes away, but when I got there, I was a little confused. There was a long driveway going into the trees, but I couldn't see any houses or lights at the end. I looked back at the map, zooming in and seeing that there was a house. It was just really far down. I turned onto the driveway and put my brights on. After the first part that connected to the main road, it became a gravel path and was honestly hard to follow because it was thin and the trees were really close to the sides. Eventually, it opened up a bit, and across a small field was an old wooden house. It was too big to be a cabin, but it definitely had that middle-of-the-woods cabin feel. There wasn't exactly a place to park, so I just stopped on the gravel and got out. A few of the outdoor lights were on, but they weren't bright at all, and most of the woods surrounding the area were completely dark. I started walking up to the door, hoping to do this quickly, because something was starting to make me feel uneasy about this place. I got up to the porch, and just before I knocked, I heard something behind me. It was leaves crunching in the woods near the gravel driveway I had just come from. I looked out there for a second, but it was too dark to see anything. So I turned back and knocked on the door. While I waited, I looked back at my car, wishing I'd left the keys inside so the headlights would stay on. Even from the porch, it was hard to see any more than just a small glare coming from the plastic reflectors. The rest of the car was not visible past the dim light coming from the house. I heard footsteps inside, then the door opened. It was an old man with short black hair and glazed-over eyes. "I have a Papa John's pizza order for you," I said as I handed him the pizza. He pulled out some cash and gave me more than I needed, but I thanked him and said he could keep the change. He gave a small smile and said, "Thank you." I nodded and turned to walk back to my car, then immediately saw something across the field. I stopped for a second, seeing a tall, dark figure. The old man spoke again, saying, "I hope you get back safely," but this time, his voice was much deeper and more disturbing. My pace quickened back to my car as I hoped he wasn't referring to what I thought he was. The more I thought about it, the more I realized what I'd seen wasn't a human, at least not one I could reason with. It was just before I reached the car door that I saw the dark figure sprinting at me from across the field. I got in, threw the keys into the ignition, and started the car as I heard the steps just behind me. The light inside my car came on when I opened the door, so when I looked back just before shutting it, I saw a disfigured face coming right at me. They jumped into the back seat, and the door caught their arm as I slammed it shut. I took off immediately and started driving back the way I came. The whole drive down the gravel path felt like a fever dream. I couldn't stay on the gravel as well this time, constantly bumping into tree roots and getting way too close to the edge. I couldn't see the field anymore, but I knew I could hear heavy breathing from the back seat. The back window had been shattered by the door, so I knew whatever was chasing me was still holding on and most likely still trying to get inside. As soon as I saw the paved road ahead, I was reminded of the fact that I wasn't too far from civilization and began to feel some sense of relief. But before I reached it, something suddenly threw me out of the gravel path and into a tree on the side. This final turn was too harsh for my car, and it wasn't able to turn back on. I stumbled out, bruised and bleeding, trying to get away from the tree. I looked back to see the figure, but it was already sprinting back into the woods and soon disappeared. The walk to the nearest house was painful and difficult, but even more so was explaining what happened to the people who opened the door. I called the police, and they sent out a couple of officers to check the house I delivered to, but all they found was the empty house. They did tell me the man wasn't supposed to be living there. The house had been abandoned for 20 years after the people living there went missing. In the end, they had to write it off as another wild animal encounter, but I knew better.